To understand the noise, you first have to understand the silence. It wasn't a quiet room. Man, arena is never truly quiet. It was the sound of apathy. It was 20,000 people looking at their phones, the blue light of screens illuminating bored faces in the upper decks. The show had been dragging on for 3 hours. As the undercard matches had finished, the main event was still an hour away, and the energy in the building had flatlined. You know that feeling when you were at a party that has gone on too long? That sticky, heavy exhaustion where you are just waiting for permission to leave? That was the air in the arena. The commentators were filling dead air, talking about upcoming pay-per-view dates and sponsor obligations. Inside the ring, a mid-card heel was pacing, trying to draw heat, yelling at a fan in the front row. But his voice echoed hollowly off the empty spaces. The production crew in the back was already thinking about the teardown. Camera operators were stretching their backs, checking their watches. It was a Tuesday night, just another stop on the endless traveling circus of professional wrestling. There was absolutely no reason to believe that history was sitting behind the curtain, waiting for a cue. This lethargy is important. It is the canvas upon which the masterpiece is painted. If the crowd had been hot, if they had been expecting a surprise, the impact would have been diluted. But they weren't expecting anything. They were lulled into a sense of mundane security. They believed they knew the script. They believed the night was over. And in that vast, bored vacuum of 20,000 tired souls, the perfect conditions for an acoustic explosion were being formed. The air pressure was low. The guard was down. And in the darkness of the gorilla position, just behind the heavy velvet curtain, a shadow was stretching out her wrists, listening to the boredom, knowing she was about to shatter it into a million jagged pieces. The sound didn't start as a cheer. It started as a gasp of collective. It's a sharp intake of breath from 20,000 distinct sets of lungs, simultaneously realizing that reality had just glitched. Then came the recognition. It took exactly 3 seconds for the brain to process the first chord of the music. And then, the roof didn't just blow off, it disintegrated. The pop was so loud, you could feel it in your chest. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears. It was a physical vibration that rattled the rib cages of the security guards standing with their backs to the ring. The lights exploded in a sequence of blinding white strobes, the pyro hit with a concussive thud, and then she walked out. Fans were shaking, screaming, pointing completely overwhelmed. There was no build-up, no dirt sheet rumors, no hints on social media. Just one historic moment that proved she's back. In the front row, a grown man dropped his drink, his hands flying to his head in a gesture of pure, unadulterated shock. The cameras caught people crying, not weeping, but sobbing, the kind of emotional release that comes when you see a ghost. Stick figures in our animation would be vibrating, their heads exploding with squiggly lines of shock. This wasn't just noise, it was energy. It was the sound of disbelief turning into euphoria. She stood on the ramp, not moving. She didn't need to. She just let the wall of sound hit her, a physical wave of adoration and shock. The commentary team went silent either, because their headsets were drowned out, or because they too were legitimately stunned. For a solid 2 minutes, nothing happened but noise. It was a sustained roar. A pop in the wrestling sense, but a cultural event in the human sense. It was the sound of thousands of people suddenly remembering why they loved this theater of the absurd. Nobody in that arena survived that moment unchanged. The boredom of 5 minutes ago was a distant memory, incinerated by the presence of the one woman who everyone thought was gone forever. While the arena was experiencing a moment of pure magic, the area known as Garilatha, nerve center just behind the curtain, was a zone of high-stakes panic. This is the side of the return the cameras never show. As she walked out into the light, the production team was scrambling. The producer in charge of the segment was screaming commands that no one could hear over the shaking walls. Cue the pyro. Cut to camera 3. Get the wide shot. Look at the crowd. It was a frantic ballet of technical direction trying to capture lightning in a bottle. Other wrestlers, the ones who had been watching monitors in the locker room, rushed into the hallway. In the world of wrestling, the lines between fiction and reality are often blurred. But a return like this cuts through the work. The locker room is a shark tank, usually filled with professional jealousy and competition. But in this moment, everyone was a fan. Heels and baby faces, who would be fighting each other in an hour, stood shoulder to shoulder, peering around the curtain, eyes wide. They were watching a masterclass in aura. However, beneath the awe, there was fear. You could see it in the eyes of the current champion standing near the monitors. This return changed the ecosystem. The hierarchy of the women's division had just been demolished in 30 seconds. Spots were going to be lost. Main events were going to be reshuffled. As the stick figure champion watches the monitor, a small bead of sweat drops. The pop out there was a threat back here. It meant the standard for stardom had just been raised to an impossible height. The writers were already tearing up next week's script, frantically typing notes on their phones. The carefully laid plans for the next 6 months were now garbage. The chaos backstage was the direct inverse of the joy in the arena. It was the frantic, terrifying realization that the entire landscape of the company had just shifted on its axis, and everyone had to adapt or drown. The segment ended. She walked back through the curtain, leaving the blinding lights for the dim, cable-strewn darkness of the backstage area. The transition is jarring. 1 second, you are a god, bathed in adoration and noise. The next, you are a human being in spandex, sweating, and out of breath. The adrenaline dump that hits a performer after a return like that is physically painful. As she crossed the threshold, the mask dropped. Stoic, confident superstar slumped forward, hands on her knees, gasping for air. It wasn't physical exhaustion. She hadn't wrestled a match. It was emotional overload. Her hands were trembling. The animation shows her stick figure form vibrating slightly, isolated in a spotlight of darkness, while people rush around her. A producer handed her a water bottle, but she didn't drink. She just stared at the floor, processing the sound she had just heard. It is a lonely feeling, oddly enough. You have just connected with thousands of people, yet no one can truly understand what it feels like to be the lightning rod for that much energy. Then came the applause. Not the raucous cheering of the fans, but the polite, respectful applause of her peers. The locker room had emptied into the hallway. This is the respect pop. It is quieter, but heavy with meaning. She stood up, straightening her back, putting the armor back on. She nodded to the producers, hugged the director, and walked toward her locker room. But the camera lingers on her face. There was a look there not of triumph, but of burden. The return was successful. Pop was historic. But now, the clock had started. Now, she had to deliver. The euphoria of the return lasts only for the night. The reality of the expectation she had just created was already settling on her shoulders like a lead weight. She was back, yes, but could she stay? Before she had even taken her boots off, the digital world was burning. In the modern era of wrestling, the show doesn't end when the camera cuts to black. It migrates to the internet. Twitter trending topics shifted instantly. The clip of her entrance music hitting was ripped, uploaded, and shared 2 million times in 10 minutes. The reaction videos started flooding, YouTubers screaming in their bedrooms, jaw-dropping reactions from watch parties in bars from London to Tokyo. The algorithm, usually a cold and calculated beast, was overwhelmed by sheer organic interest. This section of the story visualizes the pop traveling through fiber optic cables. We see the map of the world lighting up. Wrestling journalists, the ones who pride themselves on knowing every scoop and spoiler, were scrambling to explain how they missed this. How did they keep it a secret? Came the headline. In an age of leaks where every surprise is ruined by a dirt sheet report hours before the show, this genuine surprise felt like a magic trick. It restored a sense of wonder to the industry. But with the viral fame came the toxicity. Fan camps mobilized. The stands of the current champion began the defense. Returning fans began the offense. The narrative wasn't just she is back. It became she is here to save us versus she is here to steal the spotlight. The stick figure animation shows comments scrolling by faster than can be read arguments, praise, conspiracy theories. The return wasn't just a moment. It was a wedge that split the fan base in half. The media wildfire consumed everything else on the show. The main event, the championship matches, the months of storytelling prior, all forgotten. The only thing that mattered was the gif of her walking onto the stage. The internet had declared a new queen, and the coronation was happening in the chaotic, unpoliced comments sections of the world. The next week, the music hit again, but this time the pop was different. It wasn't shock, it was anticipation. She stood in the center of the ring, a microphone in hand. This is the most dangerous weapon in wrestling. The ring ropes are just cables. The microphone is where the real damage is done. She had to explain why. Why did she leave? Why did she come back? And more importantly, was this real, or was this just business? She spoke quietly, forcing the audience to lean in. The animation zooms in on the stick figure, isolated in the center of the canvas. She didn't use catchphrases. She didn't shout. She talked about the loss of passion. She talked about the injuries that didn't show up on X-Ross, the mental fatigue, the feeling of being a product rather than a person. She broke the fourth wall without shattering it. She admitted that leaving was the hardest thing she ever did, but returning was terrifying. "I didn't know if you would remember me," she said. It was a lie, perhaps, or maybe a deep insecurity masked as humility. But the crowd ate it up. They chanted her name. But watch the eyes of the other wrestlers standing at ringside. They weren't chanting, they were analyzing. This promo wasn't just a story, it was a mission statement. She was declaring war on the status quo. She was telling the world that the pop wasn't just nostalgia, it was a demand for a different kind of wrestling. The media wildfire had set the stage, but her words were pouring gasoline on it. She promised to burn the house down to build something better. And as she dropped the mic, the feedback loop signaled that the honeymoon period was over. The fight had begun. We rewind. Before the pyro, before the screams, before the trending topics, there was a quiet conversation in a kitchen. This is the scene that creates the emotional stakes. The decision to return isn't made in a boardroom with Vince or Triple H. It's made at a dinner table with family. The animation shifts from the high-contrast arena lights to soft, warm domestic hues. A stick figure sits across from a partner, perhaps a child playing in the background. "Are you sure you can do this again?" the partner asks. It's not a challenge, it's a plea. They remember the last time. They remember the ice packs, the surgeries, the days she couldn't get out of bed, the missing birthdays. The fans see the superhero. The family sees the limp. To get that pop, she has to sell a piece of her soul again. She has to leave home. She has to go back to the airports, the rental cars, the empty hotel rooms. She looks at her hands. They are healed now, but the memory of the pain is there. "I have to," she whispers. "I didn't finish the story." That is the curse of the performer. The applause is an addiction, but the legacy is a haunting. She isn't going back for the money. She is going back because she feels unfinished. The family agrees, not because they want to, but because they know they can't stop her. This sacrifice is invisible to the audience. When they screamed her name, they didn't see the empty chair at the dinner table that would be there for the next 3 years. They didn't see the hug goodbye that lasted a little too long. The cost of that historic return was paid in advance, in the quiet currency of family time, and the debt would only grow. The weeks leading up to the return were not glamorous. They were brutal. To look like a god, you have to work like a dog. The animation is gritty, repetitive loops. Running the rope switch are actually steel cables wrapped in tape leaves, bruises on the back that turn from purple to yellow. Taking bumps, throwing your body at the ground shakes the brain inside the skull. She hadn't done this in years. The first time she hit the mat in training, the wind was knocked out of her. The doubt crept in instantly. I'm too old. I'm too slow. The game has passed me by. Ring rust is real. It's the disconnect between the brain knowing what to do and the body reacting a split second too late. In wrestling, that split second is the difference between a safe move and a broken neck. She spent nights in an empty warehouse gym, training with young rookies who were faster, hungrier, and stronger. She had to relearn the timing, the spacing, the rhythm. She threw up in the trash can. She taped her ankles until they were stiff as boards. Every rep was fueled by the fear of humiliation. The nightmare wasn't getting hurt. The nightmare was coming back and sucking. The nightmare was the crowd going silent because she couldn't go anymore. That fear is what built the physique the fans saw on the ramp. That pop was bought with sweat and nausea. When she walked out, she looked effortless, cool, untouchable. But underneath the leather jacket and the swagger, her body was screaming, held together by athletic tape and sheer willpower. She was fighting her own biology to give them that moment. The return is a moment. The match is the truth. Finally, the talking stopped. The entrances were over. The bell rang. She stood across the ring from the new generation of wrestler who had grown up idolizing her, who was now looking to retire her. The crowd was buzzing, but the pitch had changed from euphoria to anxiety. Could she still go? The first lockup was tentative. The first bump was hard, but then the muscle memory kicked in. The animation flows like water, now smooth artistic violence. She moved differently than the modern roster. She told a story with her face, with her selling. She slowed the match down, forcing the audience to digest every move. It wasn't about doing 100 flips, it was about making one punch matter. But there was a moment, a slip. A slight stumble on the top rope. The crowd gasped. Not a cheer, but a worry. In that split second, the mortality of the legend was exposed. She recovered, hit her finisher, and got the 3 count. The pop was loud, but it was different. It was a sigh of relief. She had survived. She was still good. But the invincible aura of the return night had chipped slightly. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a wrestler again. Flesh and blood. Beatable. The magic trick was over, and now the grind of the weekly show began. The pop was the peak, and everything after was the struggle to stay on the mountain. So, nobody survived the return pop. Not the fans, whose standards were forever raised. Not the locker room, whose hierarchy was shattered. Not the family, who lost her to the road again, and certainly not her. But here's the twist. The pop, that deafening, chest-rattling explosion of noise, wasn't about her future. It wasn't excitement for the matches she was about to have. It was a thank you for the past. It was 20,000 people screaming a validation of a legacy. It was the crowd telling her, you mattered.